Okay, we're going to get started. It is 5:02. So welcome to all of our parents who are here today. Today our topic is on helping children with grief and loss. If you are here today, Ms. Gabby Gonzalez, she's our community liaison. She'll be reaching out to you either via private chat or just chat in the chat box to get your sign-in and information today.
Thank you.
Again, my name is Van Bowie. I'm the school social worker at Anderson Elementary School. This is my 7th year here. So I'm really excited to be a part of this parent workshop to have meaningful conversations around how we can support our children. We have a few other presenters as well. Again, Gabby Gonzalez is Anderson's community liaison, so she just raised her hand right here.
Hello, welcome.
And then we have Noemi Figueroa. She's an MSW at USC. She's gonna wave right there as well. And then we have Miss Jennifer Jimenez, and she's an MSW intern at Cal State Dominguez Hills. So she'll wave.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
All right. I was gonna say, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. This video is being recorded, the presentation that is. And so if you don't want to be seen, you can kind of turn off your video and you won't be seen. I wanted to make sure you understand that the presentation with the information and content will be recorded, but when we later break out into small groups, any stories that we share will not be recorded because we want to, of course, honor your confidentiality. So just for the duration of just kind of informational content, it will be recorded. Just so some Zoom norms, if you have questions that you'd like to ask but don't want to ask it in the group, that's fine. You can also leave it in the chat box. So you can either just stop us or and ask the question, we're okay with that, or you can leave it in the chat box. If you can mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and then to be mindful of background noise when we're speaking. I don't foresee this happening, but due to the amount of participants and time frame, we may limit the amount or the number of individuals to respond. But since we're going to have a small intimate group, we might be able to share as much as we can. And then just to be mindful of time when sharing the responses. Just a note on confidentiality. This is a super sensitive topic. And so I want to make sure that whatever we talk about stays here. Really want to make sure that we're respecting each other's stories that are being shared. And so if we can all just be mindful of the confidentiality of what we share today. So here's our quick agenda. So again, just sign in. If you can sign in with Miss Gabby, that would be great. We're gonna take we're just gonna do a brief thinking of like, what does grief look like? We're gonna go over Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's theory, stages of grief. We're going to talk about practical ways that we can help a grieving child. And then we're gonna do an activity. We're gonna break out groups, just depending on how many people there are, so that we can process all this content together. And maybe you have specific questions that you want to ask, or you just want to bounce off ideas. We will have that activity towards the end. And then to kind of close up the workshop, we're going to offer some different resources that might be helpful to you. Any questions before I begin? Awesome. All right. So I kind of wanted to pose just so that we kind of put our thinking caps on and just kind of explore how we view grief. just want to take us just a few seconds to ask ourselves, well, what does grief look like? What does grief look like? Do we think that this is what grieving looks like? When we see this image, is this what we think grieving might look like? How about this? Do we think this is what grieving might look like? Just to focus on these images and wonder how our body is feeling and where our thoughts are going. Does this look like grief? What about this child? When we see this image of this child kind of with a furrowed eyebrows and looking afar, do we think about that this might be grief? When we see this picture, do we think that they might be grieving? Two young boys with their arms on each other, just in almost like um, an aggressive situation. Do we think that they might be grieving? And for this last image, what about this young boy? Do we think he might be grieving? It's kind of just staring off in the distance, unable to focus on the task at hand. Is this something that we might think that grief might look like? So just some things to think about as I go into just the simple definition of what grief is. And to just plainly state it, it's a natural response to losing someone or something that is important to you. And that loss may be a person, thing, relationship, or situation. And so sometimes we often think about grief or loss, I'm sorry, we oftentimes think about loss as like someone dying, someone passing away. But it's so much more than that. When they say, it can be a person, it doesn't have to be about death. It could be that a person moves away voluntarily or involuntarily. It can be a person who has been deployed in the military. That can be a huge loss as well. Oftentimes relationships, the loss of relationships is also a loss that we all experience. So such things as divorce. We also hear things about when someone is diagnosed with a chronic illness. Think about somebody who might have just heard from the doctor that they have cancer. That is an extreme loss to that person and to everybody around them. And so I kind of, there's a lot of things that you can equate to as loss. So I'm wondering if any of you have other examples that might not be here, but you want to contribute to the list. Yes, I see a raised hand. And in the chat box. So there's so much to navigate. So in the chat box, Eve has said pets. Absolutely. Pets are a huge loss, not just to our children, but to us as well, because we form these really deep bonds with our pets. And Miss Crystal, you have your hand raised. Would you like to share something to contribute?
Hi. Yes. Hi, Ms. Bowie. I was going to mention a parent in prison.
Yeah, a parent in prison. Absolutely. And we have a lot of our kids who have parents in jail, in prison. And so that's a significant loss, especially if it's a parent, because there's idealizations of who this person should be in my life, right? And so I thank you both for sharing and for contributing to this list, because I think a key word for me as I've kind of delved into like understanding more about grief and loss is the idea of idealization can be a significant loss. So, for example, the biggest one that I can think of right now, and I've been jotting notes down, is this idea of the pandemic and of COVID-19 coming up in a collective way. And these ideas, the first thing I thought about was, when we shut down in March, many of our students who were fifth grade going to sixth grade, eighth grade promotes, who are supposed to promote, right, from eighth grade to ninth grade, and then our high school students and college students who were supposed to graduate. That was an idea that was completely disrupted. And that loss created a collective grief for so many children and young adults who are still going through that today. And so I think sometimes there's a larger scheme of what loss looks like, and it's to me it's interesting to really look at all the facets of it. So I just wanted to mention that before we move on. Noemi, your turn.
I can't see the. Okay. All right. So, I would be talking about. I'm so sorry about that. Grief and loss. So, grief, I'm actually going to define it, is a multifaceted response to loss. Although traditionally focused on emotions, responses to loss, grief can also have physical, behavior, social, and spiritual dimensions. And I will further explain what I mean by it. Next. Okay, so for the physical impacts of grief, that would include shortness of breath, loss of appetite, crying, fatigue, and sleep problems. For emotional impacts of grief, that would include numbness, loneliness, emptiness, anger, resentment, confusion, deep and outgoing sadness, and a loss of interest in things that used to bring pleasure to your life. The social impacts of grief may include withdrawal, isolation, conflict due to people having different grieving styles, unrealistic expectations of others. And for spiritual impacts of grief, that may include loss of meaning and a search for new meaning, questioning your spiritual beliefs, strengthening your spiritual beliefs. So I would like to actually give you guys an example. Like for example, in my neighborhood, we recently, well, not that recently, but like last year, we all went through this phase that we had one of our neighbors took their life away. So what happened, he passed away, and we made a big event, everybody was invited, and we saw, and I saw myself, that everybody grieved in a different way. Some of them had like physical impacts, a lot of them were crying with very strong emotion. Nobody was able to actually were able to calm them down, because it was just that their way of, you know um their way of getting through that loss was just crying, and they were just like experiencing these very physical impacts. On the other hand, there is these other individuals that were actually like isolating themselves. You could tell that they were just trying to be away from others. They couldn't even believe it themselves. um it was just like, it was less crime, but it was obvious as well that they were impacted by that death as well. Some other individuals have like spiritual impacts, probably like what they believe in, they're questioning it just because, like, there was this death of It was just everybody grieves in a different way, and it's just very important for us to realize that, you know, sometimes children grieve differently from us as well. So everybody has a physical impact, an emotional impact, a social impact, or a spiritual impact. All right, so that was my example. And I actually have a question. All right, from your own experience, is there anything you would like to contribute to this list? Any family member who wants to join, or anybody else?
It's okay if we, oh, yes, Crystal, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to mention for a child grieving a loss, the learning, I feel like learning could be impacted, or just their whole environment at school could be jeopardized due to grief and loss.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you bring up a good point, because in the grieving process, it and especially at school, I think all of these are combined, and you can see these things at home too. So the physical impacts, and I'm thinking about a lot of our kids who have, lost family members, just via, regardless of death, or someone who has been taken away from them. There's a lot of lack of focus in school because they're thinking about them, right? um, if you can remember all the images I was sharing earlier, we tend to think of grief as, we're just crying, or we're just, hugging somebody and letting out our tears. But what we forget to acknowledge is the fact that the grief can kind of, um what's the word, it kind of like evokes like these physical or somatic symptoms. They call it somatic symptoms, where you have no control over your body. It's like your mind goes away. You start some kids start tapping. um some kids, like, they just can't sit still anymore. For some kids, it's the complete opposite, where they sit still and they don't speak, they don't look at anybody. And so there's that emotion, or I'm sorry, that physical kind of behavior that comes up, which results in that loss of learning. They can't pay attention. When my grandmother passed away, my mom's mom passed away, it was really difficult for me. I was about 10, but I was super close to my grandma because she taught me how to cook and clean, and just be very domesticated. And so the loss of my grandma, it was I remember it was a stretch of like a month where I couldn't really focus because I was just thinking about her so much. So not only do kids lose out on their learning, but they lose out on their social opportunities to be with their friends, social opportunities to be with their family who is still around. So those are a lot of ways that the grief can really impact them. One thing I might want to add to this as well is the spiritual component. We don't really think of kids as having that spiritual component. I think adults, maybe young adults, teens and young adults, and even adults now, have that kind of spiritual crisis. Like, why is this happening to me? Why is, for those who have faith, who have a specific faith, they might say, why is God doing this to me? Right? You might hear a lot of that. And it's interesting that, as long as I've worked with these kids, I hear that from them too. And they don't actually say those things. They'll just say things um like, this is so unfair, life is so unfair. And that's actually a spiritual impact that a very young child, is able to experience and express. So we can kind of, you know when we look at this list, it's helpful for us to learn these different things, these different words and terms, because then we can sit down with our kids and we can talk to them about it. You know, I hear that you were having a hard time concentrating in class today. It sounds like you had a physical reaction, right? So when we learn these words, we're able to have a conversation with our children about it, and they're able to put words to their own grief. So I'm rambling a lot. Is there anybody else who wants to contribute to this list? All right. So I'm going to talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. So there's a lot of theories out there. There's a lot of research out there that talks about these different stages of grief. But the most popular one, and the most, for me, I think easiest one to kind of digest and understand through is Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, because she only has 5 different stages, if you will. And so these are the 5 different stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So one way that we've learned this is DABDA, if you ever care to remember this synonym for it. So Kubler-Ross says that the first stage is denial. And in denial, a person may refuse to hear the reality of the situation. So what is this? This means that there's a state of shock, right? For instance, your grandmother passed away. Your mother has been deployed. I just was diagnosed with leukemia. These are all like, no. Our first innate reaction is going to be no. This cannot be true. This is not the life I thought I was going to live, right? And so when we're in that state of denial, there's a couple of things that are happening. One, denial is, even though like we think denial is a bad thing, having denial sometimes is a defense mechanism. It's a way to kind of protect ourselves from feeling so overwhelmed. Because really, as humans, we really can only contain so much at a time. And so what denial helps us to do is kind of, okay, let's pocket this for a second, and then I'll get to it when I'm almost ready. And so in a way, denial can be very healthy. But at the same token, denial can be very toxic, because that can send people into a state where they never want to start looking at reality. They never want to start looking at the truth and how to live with the new truth or reality. So this is the kind of the dichotomy of denial. So one thing I want to say about this is, once the denial and shock does start to fade, this is where the healing process can begin. Kubler-Ross also talks about anger as being one of the stages. And so for anger, when the individual recognizes that denial cannot continue, they become frustrated, especially at proximate individuals. So again, there's this little bit of a spiritual response to it. It's like, why me? Why is this happening to me, right? And we're starting to face the harsh reality, and we start to kind of blame the people around us. So for instance, I've had several, kids come into my office and say, my parents are getting a divorce. And you know what? It's my sister's fault, because she doesn't listen to my parents and do what they say. So it's my sister's fault, and that's why my parents are getting a divorce. Another example I had remembered is a student coming into my office and saying that their mom was diagnosed with cancer. And she was like an older student, and she said, you know what? It's because it's McDonald's fault. McDonald's, she goes and eats at McDonald's all the time. I'm going to sue them. So this anger phase really evokes irrational thoughts. These irrational thoughts that may or may not be true, right? But it's the easiest way to cope with it is to find something to aim all of their anger at, because they don't know how else to control it. At that point, they're feeling so out of control. And when I say they, I mean us too as adults. We feel out of control when there's loss, and we feel like there's nothing we can do to control this situation. And so that's kind of the essence of the anger stage. In the bargaining stage, bargaining is an attempt to postpone the loss. So one of the ways, this is also another defense mechanism, something that we naturally respond to because we can't handle just the sheer overwhelming experience of losing someone. So what we tend to do is we avoid the grief through a type of negotiation. So, for example, I go back to my example of the student saying that their parents were getting a divorce. She would say, I promised to be a good daughter if they would just get back. I'll be a good daughter, mom and dad. Like, if you get back together, I'm gonna be a good daughter. Or in illness, I'll be a better child. I'll do all my homework. I'll eat all my vegetables if you just get better, right? Or if God, if you can let them be better, right? So it's different ways that they cope through the bargaining. Whoever they're bargaining with, themselves, with their higher faith, if they have one, with their family members. So many different ways that they can bargain through the loss. In the depression stage, depression is the stage when the person who is grieving actually faces the loss. Now, this is the more traditional way that we think of the grieving process. And, this is where we see the physical symptoms come up, right? The crying, not sleeping or sleeping too much, sometimes not eating or eating too much, right? You can see one or the other. Then you have, the emotional reactions, just feeling withdrawn. That's more social too, like withdrawn, not wanting to speak to anybody. Feelings of numbness. Oftentimes, there's that lack of concentration as well. So all of these things we kind of have a sense of, because it's more of the traditional way that we think about it. And then lastly, is acceptance. For Kubler-Ross, in this last stage, individuals embrace mortality or an inevitable future, or that of a loved one or other tragic event. So all I want to say here is the acceptance isn't so much like, it's okay that my loved one died. That's not the case. Or it's okay that my mom left us. It's okay that, my dog passed away. It's not about that kind of acceptance, but rather it's my loved one died, or they are gone, or they're no longer here, but I'm going to be okay. That's the difference. So it's a space where they're accepting a new reality, and they're learning to live without that person, that thing, or idealization. And I'm thinking about some of the kids I know who were supposed to graduate in 2020, and again, it's that idea of graduating with their friends, of throwing their hats, right? And it's this loss that they're still kind of grieving through. Like, I didn't get that, right? And so now it's a matter of like, okay, well, how am I going to continue my life now, right? As now a newly graduate and going to college, or not going to college and working. There's just a lot of like what am I going to do with my life now? How I'm going to move on and accept that this is going on. So these are the different stages of grief that Kubler-Ross brings forth to us, and I feel like it's very applicable to any of us and to our children. And for Kubler-Ross, with these stages of grief, you know, the 5 stages is not a linear process. So it's not like, okay, we're going to go through denial. Today I'm going to go through denial. Tomorrow I'm going to go through anger. Then I'm going to go through, bargaining, and then depression, and then acceptance. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. I wish it does. But as humans, it's a very fluid process that just goes back and forth and back and forth. It's very, as here, flexible process, and there are individual patterns of grieving. So everyone does it differently, and there's no right or wrong way. So that's what I want to say about the stages of grief, because we're moving through it all the time. If I go back to my own personal example about losing my grandma, who I was very close to, till this day, there's still times when I'm still angry. I might be making a dish that we learned together, and I might think about her, and I would think about, like, why did they take her away? So it's not like it ever really goes away. It just, there's going to be certain moments in our life where we revisit this over and over again. And this goes to Jennifer.
Okay. So 10 ways to help a grieving child. So number 1, so just being honest with your child, discussing the tragic event with your child in a simple, direct, and age-appropriate manner. Being honest and sharing clear, accurate information about what happened. Children need to hear the truth from someone they love. Number 2, to listen. Listen to your child share his or her story about what happened. Let them ask you questions and answer their questions as best as you can. Do not be afraid to say, I don't know. Number 3, acknowledge your child's grief. Recognize that your child is grieving. Be careful not to impose your grief on your child, but allow him or her to grieve in his or her own way. It is normal for children to feel an array of emotions, including sadness, anger, frustration, and fear. It is also normal for children to move in and out of grief reactions, at times being very upset or getting angry easily, and at other times playing as if nothing has happened. If you're not sure how grief is impacting your child, you can spend time with them playing, coloring, drawing, or sharing stories. Quite often, children will give you clues to their grief through these activities. And another thing, just to give an example, I come from a Mexican household, and sometimes you see, fathers tell their sons, like, oh, don't show emotion, or boys don't cry. So sometimes these types of comments, it makes the boys keep their emotions bottled up to themselves, which is very difficult for when they grow up, because sometimes when they do get older, they don't have healthy coping skills, and are not able to express how they're feeling. So it is very important to acknowledge the grief and to validate how they're feeling, just to make sure that we are aware and we're able to help them cope with it. So number 4, sharing. So tell your child stories about your own life, times you were afraid, sad, or angry. Tell them how you dealt with these situations and what you learned. Children love to hear stories about the adults in their lives, and when those adults were children. Sharing stories helps the child normalize what he or she is experiencing. So as well, just another example, in case, if we've dealt with grief ourselves, it is also really important just to let the child know, when I was younger, my grandfather passed away, and this is how I dealt with it. Maybe these are some of the ways that you want to deal with it as well. If not, you can let me know how we can process this together. And number 5, being creative. So giving your child a creative outlet to express feelings. This could be done through drawing, writing, doing crafts, listening to music, or playing games. So these are all great ways to cope with our emotions. Sometimes you can see students, if they're angry or feeling sad, they tend to draw very sad depicting images. So just making sure that you're able to process those emotions with the child and just asking the child, oh, so how are you feeling today? Or what is this drawing about? Can you explain that a little bit further? So number 6, maintaining clear expectations. So keep rules and boundaries consistent. Children gain security when they know what is expected from them. Children will often use their pain as an excuse for inappropriate behavior. While you should always acknowledge the grief your child is experiencing, you should also teach them to be accountable for their choices, no matter how they feel. So again, so clear expectations. So acknowledging their anger, for example. Sometimes they'll cope with it in unhealthy ways. So for example, putting their hands on other kids or, yelling. So just making sure we're having that communication with them and letting them know that there's other ways to cope with the anger, and not necessarily yelling or hitting, because those are inappropriate. So number 7, so reassure your child. So remind your child that he or she is loved and you are there for him or her. Following the death of a person in his or her life, a child's sense of safety can be shaken. Children often fear that you or other people in their life might die. While you cannot promise that you or others will not die, you can let your child know the plan if such an event occurs. So number 8, so creating rituals and new family traditions. Rituals can give your family tangible ways to acknowledge your grief and honor the memory of those who have died. Some of this can look like lighting candles, recognizing special occasions like the birthdays, sharing stories about those who have died, or volunteering with a local charity as a family, or some of the ways you can incorporate new traditions or rituals. Another example would be like doing an altar and just giving that space for people to be able to grieve, um, would be an example. So number 9, being patient. So you and your child are grieving, and the most intense parts of grief often take longer than we want. Grief also changes us in many ways. So be patient as you and your child experience your grief. Be patient with your child with repetition. A child often has to come back to the same details and questions. Patiently spend time with your child as they and you grow, change, and continue to construct their life story. And lastly, number 10, take care of you. So exercise, eat well balanced meals, stick to regular routines, and reach out to others for support. These activities might be difficult when you are grieving, but taking care of yourself is still very important. Grieving children do better when they have a healthy adult providing support and understanding them. So next, okay. So some ideas and activities to do with a grieving child. So number 1, they can make a memory box. And this memory box can include pictures, any objects that were given as gifts, just anything really that reminds them of the person that has passed away. Number 2, writing a letter or making a card. Number 3, reading a story together about grief and loss. Number 4, completing worksheets together. For example, there, I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's an example here in the worksheet. Just it has like to complete the sentences. Maybe having like a grateful worksheet that explains I'm grateful for blank, and they can fill that out. Number 5, writing a poem. Number 6, drawing or painting a memory of a loved one. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, also creating an altar would be another activity that would be really, really good. I know, like I mentioned, I come from a Mexican household and we believe in Dia de los Muertos. So we have that holiday, that special occasion to grieve for the members that we have lost.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. An important part about the grieving process is that we can't do it alone. It is not an individual thing to be doing. It takes a collective process. So we working together with the people that we trust and that we love, and that we know to be able to heal together and to be able to establish a new reality together and move on. So we don't really need to break up into groups, but we'll stay here for the time being since there's only a few of us. And these are just kind of posing questions of, maybe something significant you've learned from today's presentation, maybe some ideas that you've gotten from here and how you might want to implement or integrate it into your family. Or maybe you have an idea. I believe in the power of learning from one another. We all come from different narratives and different stories. And so how can we learn from one another to continue being an author of our lives and rewriting our story for the next day? So these are just some questions, but feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to stop the recording now, just so that we can talk about it, and then we'll resume when we end. Let me pause it in. All right. Okay. So so the last part of this is just some book and worksheet recommendations. For the worksheets, I'm gonna put it in the chat box. See, I'll put it in just a second. Let me just copy it. Okay. So in the chat box, I'm gonna be putting just some worksheets that we've used with our students. They're more for like primary elementary schoolers, just because I'm at the elementary school, but I'm sure if you'd like, we can look for some middle school appropriate ones. Here are some different books that we use as counselors, and I've used them in the past as well, that you can read along with your children. The Invisible String by Patrice Karst. It's a story about two siblings who learn that everyone has an invisible string connecting them to everyone they love, anywhere, anytime, through the separation, anger, and even death. So that's one of the books I really like to read. It's a very cute short story. The Goodbye book by Todd Parr, it just kind of explores the different ranges of emotions and the responses we might have when we experience loss. I'll Always Love You by Hans Willem it explores the loss between humans and their pets. It's a good one for our kids too. I Miss You, a story about death. A first look at death is a very factual book that just explains what death is. And then Ida Always is about two polar bears in the city, and Ida is diagnosed with a chronic illness, and so it kind of goes through the story between the two polar bears. Our upcoming workshops, so as I mentioned, next week for self-care, I think the English one's on the 4th and then the Spanish one's on the 5th for self-care next week. Don't quote me on that. You want to make sure to go through our website, but I'm pretty sure it's flipped because our Wednesday was English today. And that is all from me. I just want to thank you all so much for being here tonight with us and just, again, having these meaningful conversations around grief and loss, but seeing how much transformation that can come from the loss and the grief that we experience. So, I thank you, and I hope you have a good night, and we hope to see you next time.